Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to all of you tuning in from all around the world. My name is Luke, and welcome to a really special How to Academy live stream held in partnership with Penguin Live. We're joined today by Yuval Noah Harari, Professor of History at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Yuval is, of course, the author of *Sapiens: A Brief History of Humankind*, which is, it's fair to say, an international phenomenon. It has attracted a legion of fans, from Bill Gates to Barack Obama, Chris Evans to Jarvis Cocker. It has been published in over 60 languages worldwide, sold 16 million copies, and was on the Sunday Times top 10 for over 9 months. His follow-up to *Sapiens*, *Homo Deus: A Brief History of Tomorrow*, was also a bestseller and was described by The Guardian as even more readable, even more important than his excellent *Sapiens*. His new book, *Sapiens: A Graphic History*, is out now. Tonight, Yuval will be in conversation with award-winning comedian, podcaster, and actor Sarah Pascoe. Alongside sellout nationwide stand-up tours and writing a host of comedy television programs, Sarah has also written the critically acclaimed Animal: The Autobiography of a Female Body, and the Sunday Times bestseller *Sex, Power, Money*. Sarah and Yuval are going to speak for about 45 minutes, and then Yuval is going to take questions from you, the audience. So please type any you have in the little Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Well, that's more than enough from me. So without further ado, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome, on behalf of the How to Academy and Penguin Live, Sarah Pascoe and Yuval Noah Harari.
Hello. Thank you so much, Luke. Hello. Welcome to this Penguin Live and How to Academy event with Yuval Noah Harari. Today is the publication day of *Sapiens: A Graphic History, the Birth of Humankind*, which is all of us. Yuval co-wrote and adapted this book with David van der Meulen and Daniel Casanave. All attendees, those of you watching, will get a copy with their ticket, and these are being sent out, I've been promised, today or tomorrow. So you'll be getting them very soon, which is exciting. I am incredibly excited to be talking to Yuval. I have read all of his books, Homo Deus, Lessons for the 21st Century, and of course, *Sapiens*. Yuval's books have sold over 27.5 million copies in over 60 languages. His current research, which I think is so interesting, is in macro-historical questions, such as, what is the relationship between history and biology? What is the essential difference between Homo sapiens and other animals? Is there justice in history? Does history have a direction? Did people become happier as history unfolded? What ethical questions do science and technology raise in the 21st century? So they're huge questions, so relevant to all of our lives, the things that all of us are concerned about. And if you have a question while watching this, please write it down and we can ask it. We've got a good sizable chunk of time for questions from you at the end. And I also must mention, because I really hope that we can talk about this, that in 2019, Yuval co-founded Sapienship, an organization whose mission is to clarify global conversation, focus attention on the most important challenges, and support the quest for solutions, which makes me feel so hopeful. Hello. You've listened to all
it's
of
good
your
to be
work
here.
now. So this is a graphic novel of *Sapiens*, and it surprises me because I feel like everyone in the world has already read that book.
Well, it's not the same book. It's not *Sapiens* with illustrations. It's a completely different take on the basic ideas of *Sapiens*. I mean, the main idea is to try and bring science to more people. The main idea is to tell scientific stories in a new way. So we kind of broke all the academic conventions. You know, *Sapiens* is still an academic book, but the graphic novel, for me, it was the most fun project I ever worked on, because it's kind of, let's try and see different ways of telling history, of telling science. So say one chapter about the extinction of the large animals of the planet more than 10,000 years ago. Something like maybe 50% of the large animals of the planet disappeared. And we present this scientific story as a whodunit movie. Basically, we create this fictional character, Detective Lopez, and she goes around the world investigating the worst serial killers in human history, in world history, not human history. And this is not something you can do in a typical academic book, but it's okay in a graphic novel. And similarly, the evolution of different human species is presented as a reality TV show with the different species competing, who is be the last survivor. So we really explored so many different genres and ways, but still trying to stick to the basic scientific facts and the basic values of truthfulness and scientific research.
Okay, so that's so fascinating. So can you tell me how this came about? Was it always your plan that you were going to make a graphic novel one day?
Absolutely not. If there is one thing I definitely can't do, I can't draw. I draw like a 5-year-old kid.
Okay.
Maybe I have some samples here somewhere. And so it would never occur to me to try and turn this into a graphic novel. The initiative came from David and Daniel. They approached my team and me and suggested, let's do a graphic novel. And they sent some samples about how to do it. And we just fell in love with the idea. And although many of the breakthrough in how to do it, many of the original ideas of how to do it, they didn't come from me. They come from Daniel and David, who understand this genre much, much better than I do.
Yeah. So before you guys started on this project, had you read many graphic novels? Did you love the form?
I have to say that I didn't read many, and now I read quite a few to get an idea of the possibilities. I really like animation. I watched as a kid and also today as an adult a lot of animation series on television, but I wasn't very aware of the full potential of this genre in print as a book. So it was a revelation for me on many levels, that the rich world of possibilities that exist there.
Yeah. So can you tell me a little bit about the process, how the three of you went around, how you kind of created this?
It was a back and forth. I mean, basically David would take the text of Sapiens and then kind of do some magic in his mind about how to turn this completely around and find the right way to present it in a graphic form. And he would send me the basic sketch that, okay, this chapter will do that like a superhero action movie. So we need to create a few superheroes, and this will be the basic plot. And he would send me the basic idea. And then I would comment on that, and he would write down the more detailed plot. And again, I would comment on that. And then if we agree on the plot, on the main characters and so forth, it would go to Daniel, who has to draw everything.
Yeah.
And again, there is a lot of back and forth, because one of the things I realized is that maybe the biggest difference between writing a text in words and doing it in images is that words can be abstract, but images must always be concrete. And this forces you to answer many questions that in a word form you can just ignore. Like in the original version of Sapiens, I talk about the sexual relations between Sapiens and Neanderthals. 10 years ago, around that time, there was a big academic shock when it turned out from genetic research that Sapiens and Neanderthals had sex, and therefore, and had children together, not just sex. And therefore, we still carry some Neanderthal genes in our DNA. Now, when you write it just in text, you can just say, okay, Sapiens and Neanderthals had sex, end of story. When you depict it, you need to decide, okay, you have a couple who are having sex, so is it a Sapiens man with a Neanderthal woman? Or would you depict a Sapiens woman with a Neanderthal man, or perhaps two men?
Yeah.
You can't just depict general people. There are no general people. It's always concrete. And similarly, you need to decide what would be their skin color, what would be their hairstyle, And all of these questions that are very difficult, and they have obviously also political and ideological implications, you can just ignore them in a written text if you don't feel like going into these kinds of details.
Yeah.
But in the graphic novel, you must answer them. So you have to go and do the scientific research. What do we know? I mean, actually today you can know whether it was mostly sapiens men with Neanderthal women or vice versa. You have evidence even for that, as amazing as it may sound.
Yeah.
And also for things like skin color and hair color, you have evidence. And in cases you don't have evidence, then there is still a lot of discussion about the ideological, the racial, the gender issues involved in the way you depict the characters. So we had a lot of discussions about these things, and Daniel would sometimes like go crazy that he draws a scene and then sends it to us, and we come back and say, yes, but this is not according to the latest findings, and should be like that, and he has to draw it all over again. But over time, I think we got the process more smoothly.
Yeah.
So it's not like he draws everything and has to redraw everything from scratch.
Can I ask a question about that with the Neanderthal and human copulation?
Because sure.
Another thing that I guess we don't know is how much copulation was willing or forced, and that's another area for so much discussion.
Exactly. I mean, again, you can have some indication. I don't want to go into too much details unless you think we should, but there are genetic markers in what's known as Y chromosome and mtDNA, whether it was mainly sapiens males with Neanderthal females or vice versa, or more kind of equal on both sides. Now, if you find a pattern when it's mostly, say, sapiens males with Neanderthal females, and we know that in the end, Neanderthals went completely extinct and sapiens now dominate the planet, this raises the possibility, it's not a certainty, but this is usually a marker that violence and coercion was involved. Because this is the kind of pattern we see much, much later in history. For instance, in the European colonization of America or the European colonization of Australia, that it's mostly conquering males from the conquering society, and females from the conquered society, from the dominated society. And in many cases, this also implies that there is at least some element of coercion, maybe violence involved. So again, even such things, today scientists can know to a certain extent about events that happened 40, 50, 60,000 years ago.
That's amazing. Were there any topics or subjects that almost refused to become physical? Was there anything where David would ring you and go, I don't know what we do about this. It's so complicated. How do we put it in a graphic novel?
That's a good question. One of the main themes of Sapiens is the centrality of fiction. That the idea that, again, if you go back to the conflict even between sapiens and Neanderthals, and you ask, why is the world today dominated by Homo sapiens, our species, and not Neanderthals? So sapiens certainly weren't physically stronger than Neanderthals. Actually, Neanderthals even had bigger brains than sapiens. We know that Neanderthals could produce sophisticated tools, use fire. So what was it? And the best theory we have today, which is presented in Sapiens, is that it was the sapiens' ability to cooperate in large numbers. Neanderthals could cooperate 20, 40, 60 Neanderthals maybe, but sapiens could cooperate in hundreds, later thousands, today billions of people cooperate. And that's our secret of success, not individual strength or individual intellect. And then you ask, so what made it possible for us to cooperate in such large numbers? And the answer is fictional stories. If you look at any large-scale human cooperation in the past or today, it's always based on fictional stories. It's most obvious in the case of religions, millions of people believing in the same religious mythology so they can cooperate, but it's the same even in things like economics. Corporations, money are fictional stories just like gods. Corporations, Google and Facebook and Toyota and Mitsubishi, they are just like gods. They are stories that exist only in our own imagination. Actually, I would say they are much stranger stories. And Google is a much more strange story than Zeus or Shiva or any of these gods. And so this is the big Sapiens superpower, to invent fictional stories, spread them around, make everybody believe the same story, then they can cooperate. How do you present it in a graphic novel? This was a very big problem. And eventually, David came up with this brilliant idea, okay, it should be done as a superhero action movie. So we created this superheroine, Dr. Fiction, and she embodies the human superpower, should I say the sapiens superpower, to create and believe in fictional stories. And she accompanies not just this episode, but many episodes in the graphic novel. And we build on the pre-existing kind of assumptions that almost everybody has about superheroes. And it's a perfect way to do it because superheroes are also a fictional story, and it ties with the sapiens superpower of creating mythologies and fictions.
What's also so wonderful in that section is that your character is trying to convince Neanderthals that if they just used fictions, they could do things like hunt better. So very simple things. And seeing that drawn out and the difference that would make to a species' strength in terms of the amount of nutrients they can have, such a basic thing. But the Neanderthals are kind of like, nah, I don't trust people. They walk off.
Yeah, I mean, I think that humor is a very important part of telling the story. So, of course, you have all these humoristic episodes. And yes, so, it's not just Neanderthals. It's also, chimpanzees and elephants and dogs. None of them believe fictional stories. None of them believe in gods, as far as we know. None of them believes in corporations or money. Chimpanzees can trade. Like, okay, you give me a banana, I give you a grapefruit, that can work with the chimpanzees. But no chimpanzee will ever be willing to give you a banana in exchange for a worthless piece of paper, just because some banker says it has value. And it's so strange to think about it, that we usually think that we are much more intelligent than the other animals.
Yeah.
But actually our real power is not this intelligence, it's our ability to believe nonsense in a way. Because we know a lot more things than chimpanzees or rabbits, but we also believe in many more nonsense than any other animal on Earth. And strangely enough, it's the nonsense we believe that is the deep secret of our power, not necessarily the truth that we know. If you go around telling people E equals MC squared, you won't be able to win any elections on that platform. Who would vote for you just because you say, so what, E equals MC squared? Nobody is ever willing to fight wars for it, to pay taxes for it, even though it's true. To get people to cooperate, you need to tell them some religious or nationalist or even economic myth that will appeal to them.
Yeah.
And this is one of the strange things about us.
Something so incredible about seeing a picture, because in the graphic novel you point out that money, the concept of money that we believe in together as a fiction, is still covered with images of gods and totems. And then you actually show it, and I realized I've never looked at money and realized all of this symbology to convince me, to remind me, this means something. We all agree, yes?
Yeah, I mean, 50,000 years ago, two sapiens meet in the savannah somewhere and they don't know each other and they want to trade, even though it's very practical, it's still based on trust. If you don't have trust in strangers, you can't cooperate with them, you can't trade with them. Now, how do you build trust between these two strangers? The most common way to do it is to tell a story about an ancestor which is common to both of us. Yes, we don't know each other personally, but we are actually both descendants from the same common ancestor. So ancestral stories, they are always very central to trade, and also a belief in common totems. Now you go to modern money and it's exactly the same. I mean, if you look at the dollar, it's all ancestors. It's George Washington and Lincoln and Hamilton and Jefferson. The ancestors are on these pieces of paper. And also the totems, the symbols. And even the totems that are quite similar in most countries, it's still an animal. An eagle or a bear or something. You know, despite the immense distance from the Stone Age savannah until today, some things have changed very, very little.
So one of the things that's really wonderful through the book, and I know this is just the first section, and there'll be further sections, but is that it's characters explaining things to other characters. So your character has a niece called Zoe, and occasionally she might tell you something that she already knows, or you might be explaining something to her or taking her to visit another academic, or you go and you speak to Robin Dunbar, the anthropologist. And so I wondered then, in terms of this book and your readers, if you have an idea of someone who might read this, who hasn't read any of your other work.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, the idea was not to create a companion to Sapiens, but to create something completely fresh, completely new, that people don't need to read any of my previous work to understand it and to connect to it. And at the same time, that it will be different and fresh enough so even people who've read the original version can read this and find a lot of not only new information, but also the whole way of telling the story is completely fresh. And yes, we also incorporated other academics, some real people like Robin Dunbar, who we are grateful that he agreed to be a character in the book, and some fictional. Actually, this was one of the biggest discussions we had in the beginning, because Daniel and David, they came and say, okay, you must be a character in the book. And I said, absolutely not. I mean, I don't like to be a character in the book. It feels, I don't know, kind of strange and not inappropriate in some way. But they insisted that, you know, in the original book, you appear as some kind of abstract authorial voice. Here, again, everything must be concrete. We need a narrator. So eventually, after a lot of debates and arguments, the agreement was, the compromise was, okay, I will appear, but as part of an entire cast of scientists. It won't be just me explaining everything. We'll have 5, 6, 7 scientists. Again, some real, some fictional entities. And the idea is that, you know, science is always a communal enterprise. It's done by a community of people, not by some individual genius. Almost everything I know about Neanderthals and chimpanzees and the Stone Age and so forth, it doesn't come from my research. I never conducted an archaeological excavation in my life. I don't know how to do DNA testing, and I never went to watch chimpanzees in the wild. So I really rely on the insights of so many other scientists who deserve the credit. And also creating this kind of community of scientists enabled us to show that there are different disciplines and different approaches and sometimes disagreements. So we have one scientist presenting one theory, and then somebody comes and says, no, it was different, and we can have a debate between them.
With so many people don't have a science background. And so even with a popular science book, they might feel like, oh, that's not for me, or I don't understand. And what I think will be wonderful about the graphic history is, even though it is just as complicated what it's talking about as your other work, people will feel like, oh, I can read this because it looks so instantly accessible. And it seems to me that you have such a passion for sharing information and making it accessible, that you want everyone to know the things that you know.
Yeah, that's the main idea, to include everybody in the conversation, not just a small circle of academics or professors and students and so forth. And, you know, especially in recent months during this pandemic, I think everybody realized the immense importance of bringing scientific knowledge to as many people as possible. If scientists don't make the effort, if they remain just within their ivory tower speaking with one another, they are leaving the space open for all these conspiracy theories and all this misinformation and so forth. So we need, as scientists, to make the effort to talk with everybody and talk in a way that is accessible. You know, scientists among themselves, they so often speak in a professional jargon, in statistics and numbers and graphs and models, which is all fine. You know, it's how things done, but most people are left out. Yeah. And we need to make the effort to find a way to communicate the basic knowledge, at least, to everybody. And that's the great thing about, you know, graphic novels and animation series and science fiction TV series, that they are all different ways to bring these ideas and these discoveries to everybody.
But also at school, so because science is an applicable thing about us and that affects us, not just an old textbook that is just, you know, formulas that don't mean anything to children. Because part of the problem we have in the UK is some people don't have a scientific literacy. Even so, studies, not even conspiracy theorists, but in the newspapers, they'll say, oh, chocolate causes cancer. And people don't know how to read studies. So they just go, well, that's the fact. So they wouldn't put it in the paper.
Yeah, I mean, it's more and more subjects that dominate the world and our lives require a certain level of scientific understanding. It was all before with climate science, which became politicized. Now epidemiology is politicized. Very soon it will be artificial intelligence and bioengineering, which will also be major political subjects. This idea that we can keep science, you know, separated from this messy world of political debates, it's not going to work. So yeah, we need the scientists in the laboratories who are doing the cutting edge research, but we also need the people who kind of build the bridge between what's happening in the laboratories and the archives and the universities and everybody else. Otherwise, it's an extremely dangerous situation, because then more and more of politics is going to be based and dealing with scientific issues. And, you know, again, coming back to the pandemic, if people don't know what a virus is, or if people don't know how a vaccine works, it's now extremely dangerous. And the thing is that, yes, science has a built-in problem in a way, which is that reality is really complicated. When you invent some conspiracy theory or spread misinformation, you can invent whatever you want. Usually you invent something very simple that people can immediately understand. Okay, a group of multi-billionaires have created this in a laboratory to take over the world. Yeah. This is something we saw 100 times in science fiction movies. We get it. It's easy. Yeah. The problem with presenting scientific facts is that reality is often extremely complicated. Like you think about a virus. What a virus actually is. It's so complicated because a virus is not even a living organism. It's not even a bacteria, it's not a cell. A virus is just a piece of biological code, of genetic code, that's it. It doesn't eat, viruses don't eat, viruses can't reproduce by themselves. They are just a bit of biological code that have this amazing ability to infiltrate into our body cells, hijack the mechanism of the cell, and tell the cell to produce more copies of the virus, of that biological code. So one virus hijacks the cell, it produces thousands, which then hijack the other cells, and this is how it spreads, goes viral. Now this is such a counterintuitive thing, or such a strange thing to understand that it's not even a living animal.
Yeah.
And it's, you know, and if you don't know that, then you can't understand COVID-19.
Yeah, if it connects back to what you're talking about with fictions in our brains, if the first story you hear isn't what a virus is, but it's that 5G is giving it to you, and so that feels like truth. It feels like that is evidenced by the virus. I know someone who doesn't believe in evolution because she thinks it's too far-fetched. She thinks the idea of all of these bones, and you can put them in order, and millions of years, like she thinks that God is the simpler version. It's like, that's the simple one. Makes more sense.
She's right. I mean, and it's without doubt, science is far stranger than any mythology that any religion on earth ever managed to come up with. And for me, that's the sign that science is true. Yeah. Not that science is false. I mean, it's so strange in a way. If you think about, forget viruses, if you think about something like quantum mechanics, it's so bizarre that nobody could ever have thought about it unless they actually had the evidence that forced them in that direction. You know, in so many mythologies, it's the basic idea is you just take your everyday life and project it on a big screen. Like you make somebody angry, they punish you. Okay, this is why there was an earthquake. We made somebody big, angry, so there was an earthquake. Or what happens after we die? In so many mythologies, after you die, what happens is exactly what is happening now. Like, okay, you like to eat good things, and so after you die, you go to paradise and you have a lot of tasty food. I just read a wonderful book about a tribe of whalers on an island in Indonesia, that their entire culture is focused on whaling, also fishing, but mostly whaling. What do they believe happens to people after they die? After they die, they go to the island of the ancestors, where they wail all day.
Yeah.
Now, what do Orthodox Jews believe? All life they study the Talmud and the Torah. What happens after you die? If you are good, you go to heaven where you study the Torah all day. So, you know, there is not a lot of imagination there. In contrast, you try to understand something like a virus or quantum mechanics or evolution, and this is really, really strange.
Yeah. It's very, it links to something that you talk about in Sapiens, which is about how lots of apes do lie and trick. So even though they don't create the fictions, they can be devious. And it feels like with human beings, we got much better at creating fictions, which means that our ability to deceive is now huge, which means that distrust of whether it's science or when you have conflicting stories, there's something in humans that makes you go, no, I don't believe you. I think you're trying to dupe me here.
I think part of it, I mean, mostly it's not lying. I mean, most conspiracy theories are not lies. You lie when you know something isn't true and you intentionally deceive people out of some interest. And this is something that other animals also do. Chimpanzees lie to one another a lot. Fiction, I mean, conspiracy theories, mostly, some people spread them or invent them on purpose to deceive, but most people honestly believe them. And you see this YouTube video and you send it to your sister and your mother and your friends because you really believe that, hey, I finally discovered what's the truth behind the pandemic. You don't try to deceive. And the other thing is that because human cooperation is based on belief in shared stories, then when science undermines one of these stories, it's a big thing because it really threatens the social fabric. I mean, unfortunately or not, we have inherited thousands of years of history. And in a way, we all live inside the dreams of dead people. We live inside the nations and religions and economic theories and ideologies that were dreamt by people sometimes hundreds, sometimes thousands of years ago. And many of them are just a product of our imagination. And when science undermines it, it really threatens the social fabric. And it's a very delicate process. How do we create a more truthful and scientific worldview without undermining the social system? It's very, very delicate. Again, the idea that we just need to tell people that scientific truth and that's it, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a long and difficult process.
I'm going to ask you a big question now, and it's okay if you don't have it. I'm not asking for a simple answer. So, because of fictions and human ability to create bigger and bigger groups who all agree on something, as you described, will there be a time, because technology now enables us to have this chat on different parts of the planet at different time codes, which is crazy, and we will be watching this like in the morning in Australia. When we want to feel hopeful, we hope that one day will we all feel like one tribe. Like we might have disagreements, but do you think there will come a point where we are united in certain fictions, like human rights, or waiting till you're an adult to get married, and just certain things? Will there come a point where we all agree?
It already happened in a way. We are much more, despite all the disagreements and conflict, which we have a lot of. I come from the Middle East, so I know perfectly well there is still conflict in the world. We are still more united than in any previous time in history. Some stories are common now to almost all of humanity. Fictional stories, maybe money is the best example. People all over the world believe in money and in the same money. Even Osama bin Laden was happy to accumulate American dollars. He hated the USA and American culture and American politics. He had no objection to American dollars. So this is one, and it's just a story. They have no objective value. I mean, today, even most dollars are they don't even bother to print them. The last year, the Federal Reserve has created, I don't know how many billions of dollars. When they create today dollars, they don't even bother to print. Somebody goes into a computer somewhere and adds a zero, and poof, you have $1 billion born out of nothing. And it all depends on everybody believing that, you work for a month, and at the end of the month, you're willing to, you work in exchange for having some bits of data being transferred from one computer file to another computer file. As long as you're willing to do it, it works.
There was a woman,
so this is one.
Yeah. There was a woman in the UK who made up a cryptocurrency, and she made so much money because exactly what you're describing, that she believed in it. And every year when people said, "Where's my money? I would like to withdraw it," she would go, "I'm going to double your money. I'm going to double your currency." And they'd go, "Great! I just doubled my cryptocurrency." And it didn't. And we think that our money is real, but it's the same. Somebody made it
It's the same.
Yeah.
It's just, again, more people agree on it than on that. And, it's the same with Bitcoin, and it's the same with everything. It's just, it's not bananas. It has no real physical objective value in the world. So you have these kinds of fiction, which are common to almost everybody. And also you have true stories, which are common, maybe not to everybody, but all over the world. Again, with COVID-19, it's the best example. Even though you have misinformation, you have conspiracy theories, basically all the governments of the world almost agree on, this is a virus, and the vaccine can work against it. You go back to the Black Death 500 years ago, 600 years ago, spreading all over Asia and Europe and Northern Africa, killing between a quarter and half the population of these continents, and nobody had any idea what was causing the Black Death. Every country, every area had a different theory. It's black magic, it's astrology, God is punishing us, whatever. Nobody was even close to the truth. As far as we know, nobody suspected. It's a tiny, tiny organism which is being passed around by fleas who are riding on rats. Nobody came up with the right solution. And so this was 500 years ago. Now, when COVID spread, all the world, almost all the world, at least the people at the top, accepted the same scientific explanation. And more generally, whereas in the past, people had very different stories about what is the human body, what is it made of, and what is a disease, what is causing disease. Today, you're sick in Beijing, or in Tel Aviv, or in London, or in New York. Doctors have exactly the same theories about what is your body made of, and what is a disease, and what is causing it, and how can it be cured. So some things already are global to all of humanity.
Okay, well, that's brilliant. I'm going to move over to some questions from the viewers. I have one here. It's from Schumann. And they ask, what is the best way to begin restoring public trust and enthusiasm in science? Which is a great question. And then there's a second part, which is, do you think the COVID-19 pandemic will result in accelerated engagement in conversations about existential risk? Big question.
Well, how to restore trust in science? First of all, I think there is more trust in science than in any previous time in history. I have this bias. I am a medievalist. Originally, I was a specialist in the Middle Ages. I wrote about the 100 Years' War and the Crusades and things like that. So I always compare things to the baseline of the Middle Ages. And this makes me a bit optimistic about many things. And we are better than in the Middle Ages. And there is more trust.
That's such a low bar.
But I mean, during the epidemic, I was amazed that, when the scientists said, close down the churches, even the Pope and the leaders of the churches and the synagogues and the mosques mostly agreed. You had in Easter, Pope Francis conducting Mass online in an empty Vatican. This was not the case in previous centuries. So there is already more trust in science than before. I think we need to push harder, because what's at stake is, as I said before, all the existential challenges facing humankind demand a basic scientific, you don't need a PhD in computer science or epidemiology, but you need a basic grasp of the theories, of the facts. And what I do, for instance, with the graphic novel is exactly that, to make it more accessible. That I think everybody is, in at least some extent, curious and interested in such things. There is nobody on the planet who is not interested in diseases. Maybe there are some people who don't care about the Roman Empire, or about Neanderthals, but there is no person on Earth, even before COVID, who is not interested in diseases. So the interest is there. If you present the material in an accessible and interesting way, people will engage. And about the existential risk question, I think that after our experience over the last year, I think it's highly likely that people and government will take much more seriously both the threat of future pandemics and also other warnings about existential threats. Because, you know, the pandemic, there were warning. Everybody in the epidemiological community was waiting for the big one for years. So it wasn't really such a big surprise. And I hope that we will learn the lesson with regard to other threats like climate change or like the potential rise of artificial intelligence.
Okay, that's brilliant. We've got another question. This one's from Katya. You have argued that mankind has conquered the main challenges it faced throughout history, and this results in a loss of purpose or the need for a new challenge. Does COVID-19 cause you to reevaluate whether we have conquered disease? Is this a new challenge or is it re-emerging older challenge? That's a great question. Thank you, Katja.
I think I'll make it more precise that I don't think we have conquered all disease. I mean, new diseases, we have no control over evolution. New diseases continue and will continue to emerge. But for the first time in history, we now have the scientific knowledge and the technological ability to control pandemics. And I think that COVID-19 actually proved it and did not disprove it. Again, the baseline is something like the Black Death. And there are many more such cases throughout history. And epidemic starts, nobody understands what is happening, nobody has a clue how to stop it, and it kills millions, sometimes hundreds of millions of people, and humanity is helpless. This was the situation for most of history. Even a century ago, during the big flu epidemic of 1918, scientists did not really understand what was happening. With COVID, it just took 2 weeks to understand this is a virus, this is how it spreads, this is its entire genetic code. And we have, and we should really emphasize it, we have this today for the first time in history, we have the scientific ability to control pandemics. Not to prevent their emergence in the first place, but once they start, we can control them generally. What we don't always have is the political wisdom. And what we have seen over the last year is, I would say, an amazing scientific success coupled with terrible political incompetence. Scientists all over the world cooperated to quickly understand what is happening and what can be done about it. But there was a failure of political leadership on a global level and in many countries also on the national level. And, you know, this is, as a historian, I know that there is often a huge gap between human power and human wisdom. We are much better at accumulating new power than at developing the wisdom how to use it correctly, and COVID is no exception to this general rule.
Do you think that scientists would make good politicians?
Absolutely not.
Okay.
I'm not in favor of having a government of scientists. It's a bad idea.
Okay.
A politician is a vocation. It has its own skills, very different from the skills of scientists. I think they need to cooperate. I think they need to trust each other. I think politicians need a good scientific understanding to deal with all kinds of problems. They don't need to be scientists or to have a PhD in epidemiology or computer science or whatever.
Yeah, okay. So we've got a question here, which is, so a few people have been looking at the books behind you nosily to see what you're reading. And they've asked, which book have you found most enlightening in recent times?
From the ones here or generally?
In general.
In general. So I mentioned this book about the whaling community in Indonesia. It's called The Last Whalers. It sounds like a very niche subject, but it's really a very good book, which it really covers big issues like modernization and globalization, but from a very unique perspective, so I can definitely recommend it. From the ones here, Masha Gessen's The Future is History, I found very compelling and interesting.
So I'm writing these down now. The last waivers.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, sorry. I thought I'll be annoyed if I go, bye. Oh no, what were the books? And do you read a lot? Do you read for pleasure?
Yeah, I read a lot. I mostly actually listen to books because I don't have much time to sit and read. But when I go, I usually try to take a walk of at least an hour every day so I can listen to a book at the same time, or I drive, I would listen to a book, or I cook. So I would make soup and listen to some book at the same time. Yeah. So I listen a lot to books.
Oh, that's brilliant. I think I've got another, okay, so this is an interesting one. Do you have any advice for how to be an activist without getting depressed? I think that's a hard question.
That's a hard question. I mean, first of all, join an organization. First, because join an organization because you would be far, far more effective. 50 people in an organization can accomplish far more than 500 isolated individuals, activists. And in addition, it provides the community support. You're not alone. If you try to be a lonely activist, there is very high chance you will burn out. If you're part of a community, then you get the necessary support. I think this is the best recommendation that I can give. And also really to try to focus on one thing which is really close to your heart and focus on what you can actually do practically instead of engaging with all kinds of dystopian scenarios that, oh, this might happen, this might. No, think what can I actually do right now or tomorrow morning. And I can't control the whole world, but I can at least do that.
And also remember, it was much worse for activists in the Middle Ages.
Yes. That's absolutely true. Yeah, I mean, if you read a book about activists in the Middle Ages, it will immediately cheer you up. I guarantee it.
And so this is an interesting question from Max, which we haven't touched on at all here. What is music? And why does it exist, since it has no discernible purpose, I think that might be debatable, in terms of human survival during evolution?
The simple answer that I don't know.
Yeah.
I do think it has a lot of also practical purposes. And in almost, I talked a lot about the importance of large-scale cooperation and the centrality of stories and mythologies and ceremonies to create this cooperation. It almost always goes with music. So this is certainly a very central role of music, is bringing people together. But it's really not my subject, so I'm not sure.
Actually, it links to your graphic novel because human beings remember more and enjoy learning more when they're enjoying themselves. So things like music, we know it helps us remember lots more things. You tell a song about the landscape and where to find things, like bees do their little dance. Human beings have learned to use song to tell stories, and it's pleasurable. So we enjoy it and we don't realize we're hearing all of the myths and the old stories and the morality tales and those kind of things.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, in order to really reach people with a story, it can't be confined to a single genre. You just have the priest tell the story at the temple every weekend. No, it would never work. You have to incorporate it in song and dance and image and theater and architecture and whatever.
It's a great question, though. So a few people have asked, what has changed or surprised you about the world since you wrote Homo Deus?
What has changed? Well, things moved much faster in some ways than I expected. With the rise of digitalization and automation and the shift in authority from humans to algorithms, I thought it would actually take longer than what we are seeing right now. And again, with COVID, there is a further acceleration. So this is why I definitely didn't see COVID-19 coming.
No.
Again, there was always the option that some pandemic would arrive. It's always on the cards in history, but it wasn't at the center of my radar, that's for sure. And most of the day-to-day political events and economic events, I'm as surprised by them as everybody else. Yeah. History is not deterministic. It doesn't move in a linear way. You can say something about the general direction, and you can map the big possibilities ahead of us, but the actual day-to-day results of the election in the US or whatever, I'm as surprised as I think anybody else.
I think that's a brilliant thing about you, actually, because you're so curious. You don't think you have all the answers already. Whereas if I was as clever as you, I'd be like, no, I'm psychic. I know what's happening.
No, I think that the point is that maybe it's because of the discipline I'm coming from. I don't know, I don't want to insult other disciplines, but whether it's economics or meteorology, the main thing is to predict what will be the weather tomorrow, when is the next big economic crisis coming. And history is a completely different way of thinking, because one of the basic things about history is that it's not deterministic. And very often, the most unexpected things happen. If you lived in the Roman Empire and somebody told you that this tiny Jewish sect, Christianity, would take over the empire, you would think it's the most ridiculous thing you ever heard. And if you live in Russia in 1914 and somebody tells you, in 3 or 4 years, Lenin's Bolsheviks will take power, you would think this person is completely out of their mind.
Yeah.
And part of the thing about studying history is not to limit our horizon of possibilities to a single deterministic outcome, but just the opposite, to expand. Many more things can happen than what we initially think. Our thinking is usually conditioned by the last few years. We look back 5, 10, 20 years, and we extrapolate a straight line to the future. Looking back centuries, one of the things it does, it makes it easier to understand, no, there is one thing is certain. History will not continue on its present course. There will be huge surprises. I just can't tell you what they are, because otherwise they wouldn't be surprises.
Yeah. I'm going to see if I can get through a couple more questions before we finish. So, this is interesting, and it's something you touched on already. People have asked, will humans be able to stop climate disaster? And you just told us you can't predict. And now I'm saying, can you please predict what we can do about the climate?
If the question is whether we can, then the answer is yes. It's possible. We have the power to do it. But whether we'll actually, I don't know, because it depends on the choices we make. If you can just prophesize the future, and it's certain, 100% guarantee this will happen, what's the point of telling people? They can't do anything about it. The whole point of talking about the negative scenarios for the future is that something can still be done. We can prevent it. Yeah. So I think that we still can prevent the worst of the climate crisis, but I don't know if we will, because again, as a historian, I know that we should never underestimate human stupidity. It's one of the most powerful forces in history. It would be wise to stop the climate, the continuing deterioration, not just the climate, the entire ecological system. But humans have a record of not doing the wisest thing, so who knows?
It's so linked to something that you depict brilliantly in the graphic novel, which is the fact that because we didn't evolve for now, we eat too much. And very similarly, we didn't evolve to think about the very, very distant future and the effects of our actions now, whether that's hunting or eating or, getting rid of rubbish. I'm going to try and squeeze in some more questions. I find this very interesting. So this is from Mariana. A few days or weeks ago, there was a new study detailing how we missed the fact that some women were hunters as well. How accurate do you think history experts and scientists have gotten the role of women over time? That's a big question.
It's a big question. I would say not very accurate, because for centuries, maybe even millennia, scholars and thinkers were working under the influence of very, very strong biases about gender and about women. And again, this is kind of living in a dream of dead people. That this patriarchal dream that is thousands of years old, you can't just get rid of it in 10 years or 50 years. So over the last few decades, there has been a tremendous revolution, reassessment of the role of women in human history, but there is still a lot of ground to cover, and there is just so much we don't know. And the tendency is that when we don't know something, we just project our biases on it. So, you know, you have, how much evidence do we have about who, we know that humans hunted mammoth 40,000 years ago, 30,000 years ago. Who did it? Who actually went to the mammoth hunts? We have very little evidence about it. Now, it's very easy to just project our own biases and say it's only the men. But do you actually have hard evidence? You don't. And it's kind of a vicious circle that afterwards, when you make arguments about the present, you say, well, we know from science that men were always the hunters. Yeah. We don't know that for sure. So again, we try to explain the past by projecting the present, and then we justify the present on the basis of our projections on the past, and it's a circle. So we need hard evidence to break this circle, and until we don't have the evidence, we have to be careful. Again, we need to say something, but we need to have a realistic assessment of how certain we are about what we say. So I'll give another example related to that. We have no idea what family structure was like in the Stone Age. This is something that is discussed at length in the graphic novel.
And I think what's really brilliant as well is you talk about family dynamics and especially about pair bonding between same-sex couples, because quite often, and it's no one's like conscious fault, but in evolutionary stories, we make everyone heterosexual because that's how genes are passed on.
Exactly. Now, do you actually know that there were gay couples 40,000 years ago? Maybe even a sapiens and a Neanderthal mixed species gay couple, like the ultimate. Now, how can you know such a thing? Until you find frozen in the Siberian tundra a sapiens man and a Neanderthal man hugging and kissing, and even then you can, oh no, it wasn't sex, it was some kind of ritual exchange. How would you be able to know? So you have to keep open the space for the possibility and realize that at present we don't have the hard scientific evidence, but maybe in 20 or 50 years we will have, because so many things that sounded like science fiction 20 or 30 years ago, now they are science. Like what we mentioned earlier about discovering whether sapiens and Neanderthals had sex. 50 years ago, this would have sounded like impossible. Never in 1,000 years would scientists be able to have a evidence-based opinion on that. And then you have the breakthrough with genetic research, and now we have very hard evidence about it. So maybe there will be a way also to research things like gay couples in the Stone Age in a couple of decades.
That's fantastic. Right, so we've got the last question, and I have to tell you that you've had over 115 questions asked. People were very, very, very keen. But this is the very last one. So it's, I'm going to mispronounce this person's name, but do my best. It's Dr. Juravlika. I'm a secondary school teacher watching with some students. What do you think is the most important lesson from Sapiens that you would want young people to know? That's a brilliant last question.
Well, maybe it's the huge gap between our power and our wisdom, and even more so between power and happiness. That we as a species, Homo sapiens, we are brilliant in gaining more power, but we very often don't have the wisdom to use that power, and therefore we often misuse it, and it doesn't increase the happiness in the world, it actually causes more suffering. Which is why, when again you look back to the Stone Age, we are thousands of times more powerful than our ancestors in the Stone Age, but we are definitely not thousands of times happier than people in the Stone Age. Maybe we are a little bit happier, and even about that I'm not really sure. And this is not just a lesson about the past, it's also a very important lesson about the present and the future, because now humans are developing even bigger powers than ever before. We are really acquiring divine powers of creation and destruction. We are really upgrading humans into gods. We are acquiring, for instance, the power to re-engineer life. And we have to be extremely careful not to confuse this power with wisdom. And we have to be extremely careful to, this time, get it right, use the power to liberate people and other animals from suffering, don't make the typical mistakes that humans make, which result in increasing misery in the world.
Okay, that's a brilliant thing for all of us to hear, not just young students, because we can all still be part of not making the world worse. I'm going to say thank you so much, because like everyone else watching, I could listen to you talking and teaching me for hours and hours and hours and hours. And I'm so grateful. And I'm excited for everyone watching to get their books over the next few days and get into reading them and sharing the information. And so thank you so much. And thank you to Penguin and the How To Academy for hosting us.